Innanzitutto un ringraziamento molto vivo agli organizzatori e ai loro staff, soprattutto Pietro Marani e Rodolfo Maffeis. Mi sento molto onorato di parlare qui oggi. Pietro, mi sono reso conto che ci siamo incontrati esattamente 20 anni fa, quando tu non eri ancora il superstar del Dipartimento di Design, ma il rising star. E mi sembrava già in questi anni che Pietro è stato un leonardista esemplare per completezza e per ciò che Erwin Panofsky probabilmente chiamerebbe decompartimentalizzazione, no? Cioè apertura, interdisciplinarità della mente. Parlo in inglese per mancanza di tempo, mi sento molto colpevole, anche molto male, ma non ho avuto il tempo anche di chiedere a una persona di farlo tradurre, e così lo sarà. With the claim that every means of communication and any science relies on images or visual signs, with the concept that objects in nature continually emanate portraits of themselves, and that only through painting is it possible to represent the permeation of simultaneity and succession in nature, Leonardo developed powerful arguments that reach well beyond the confines of the paragone. We may therefore expect to find Leonardo among the enthusiastic supporters of the continuous inner production of images in the fantasia, described by two of Leonardo's most influential authors, Aristotle and Augustine. In fact, he was far from it. In the 15th paragraph, written after 1500 of his posthumous Libro di Pittura, Leonardo deals a devastating blow against literature, Pittura's main rival in a culture dominated by humanism. And I just quote 2 or 3 sentences. The beginning, the imagination, immaginazione, does not see as excellently as the eye sees, because the eye receives the species or similitudes of objects and gives them to the impressiva, and the impressiva gives it to the senso comune, and there it is judged. And then at the end, but the imagination of such a body does not enter into the common sense, but is born in the dark eye, nasce in l'occhio tenebroso. Oh, what difference there is between immaginarsi, such a light in the dark eye, and seeing it in action outside the darknesses, vederla in atto fuori delle tenebre. This text, with its unusual, unfamiliar terminology, needs some explanation. Leonardo bases his argument within the context of traditional faculty psychology and its insistence on the material basis of knowledge. The human eye perceives objects with more clarity or brilliance, one could also say intensity, eccellentia, than solely through imagination, immaginazione, because it receives the optical emanations of things directly before forwarding to the first ventricle of the brain. And in contrast to traditional psychology, Leonardo calls this first spiritus-filled vessel of the human brain impressiva. From there, the similitudini of objects, the inner images, proceed to the second ventricle, the common sense, senso comune, where they are spontaneously judged according to categories like number, size, movement, etc. And I have to say, this whole background was, of course, revealed to all of us by Martin Kemp repeatedly. In striking contrast to this natural process, the poet produces fictitious representations, fancies in the reader's mind, or more precisely, in the immaginativa, a faculty that shares the second ventricle of the brain with the common sense. From this point of origin, the poet's representation moves back into the third vessel of the brain, the memoria, where it fades and eventually dies, si ferma e muore. Leonardo compares the maker of inner images, the immaginativa, to a dark eye, occhio tenebroso, with its products lacking the intensity of sensory images that are perceived outside the darkness. The words written by the poet, therefore, evoke within the reader merely bloodless, pale, and shadowy surrogates of the visible. A more careful analysis of the text reveals 4 specific features that I would like to address rapidly before I conclude with a look at Leonardo's own poetic, imaginative work. 1, the epistemological circle of perception and action and its mutilation by poetry. 2nd, Leonardo's creation of a new psychological agent, the so-called impressiva or imprensiva. 3rd, the adaptation of religious metaphors by art theory and epistemology. And 4, Leonardo's model of an assimilative rather than an autonomous, free and inventive imagination. So 1, the trajectory of inner images. Leonardo's, to go back, the epistemological model is inspired by a classic text, the 3rd book of Aristotle's treatise on the human soul. Aristotle differentiates between the faculties of the soul as self-preservation in nourishment or metabolism and reproduction, perception, self-motion, and knowledge. The 5 senses link the animated organism with the world, while a 6th, the common sense, spontaneously perceives the shared categories of all sensory data, size, movement, number, and time especially. If the object is outside the field of actual perception, another faculty of the soul comes into play, fantasia. With a malleable, wax-like structure, fantasia preserves images of past presences, thus providing a mental substitute for the absent. Further, aided by the innate heat of the body, it separates and recombines elements of the sensory perceptions. Lastly, the inner representations of objects are stored in the memoria. From there, they can be recalled by fantasia, capable of processing both actual perceptions, representations, and remembrances. Further developing Aristotle's model, the physician Galen, in his medical writings, locates the faculties of the soul in the brain. In his influential book on the nature of man, written at the end of the 4th century, the Syrian bishop Nemesius of Emesa specified their location in the 3 ventricles of the brain, and Leonardo draws them repeatedly as one example. They became the place where image-saturated substances bridged the material and the immaterial. The brain's spiritus or pneuma-filled vessels were the place where the immortal human soul communicated with the material world. For Christian authors, fantasia, or as Augustine called it, the imaginatio, was a suspicious place, both a site of human freedom and of spontaneous image generation. The combinatory power of imagination became the battlefield of angels and demons, creating both celestial visions and infernal monsters. The direction of phantasmata usually proceeds from front to back, from the sensus communis to memoria. Since the reception of Avicenna in the 13th century, the locations of the facultates animae became more specific, with the sensus communis and receptive imagination, imaginatio, often working in the 1st ventricle, the deliberative, as Martin Kemp called it, more autonomous imagination, imaginativa, together with higher sensory mental operations, extimativa, cogitativa, and so on, in the 2nd, and memoria in the 3rd ventricle, in the back of the brain. Albertus Magnus, referring back to the Syrian physician Costa ben Luca, explained the epistemological trajectory in his Summa de Homine. According to this theory, the process starts outside the body and continues within. The material vehicle driving this process is the spiritus, flowing from the front of the brain to the back, and subsequently through the hollow channels of the nerves in the spinal cord to the limbs, triggering physical movements. A cyclical structure, cyclical as it were, from the passive to the active, from perception of the world to its transformation by human action, or from knowledge to ethics. Leonardo's reference to both the immaginazione and the immaginativa in the text that I quoted at the beginning reveals that he was well aware of this tradition. He criticizes that the poet's products reflects only a fraction of the epistemological cycle. The inner images of poetic fantasy are not received, judged, or metabolized and eventually stored. Instead, they are produced in the second ventricle of the brain, the immaginativa, where their lack of mobility and dynamics leads to their quick death inside the memoria. According to Leonardo, these inner autonomously forged images never obtain the same degree of lifelessness or brilliance or intensity, eccellencia, as their natural siblings. They are stillborn children of the mind. This is, of course, a slap in the face for every advocate of literary enargaia or evidencia. For Leonardo, poetic imaginations have the power to cover only a very short distance, that is, from one ventricle of the brain to the next, just a fraction of the full cycle of outer and inner images. Indeed, elsewhere Leonardo refers to the imaginative libera finzione as the weakest part of pittura, chapter 33 in the Libro di Pittura. But in other passages of his writings, he demonstrates an awareness of the power of imagination. At one point, he asks himself why dreams, paradigms of fantasia, spontaneous operations, why dreams are much more vivacious than fantasies created in an awake mental state. Leonardo's claim that paintings can provoke laughter from the audience, but never weeping, sounds like a note of caution, especially in comparison with the recurring event of his time, namely enormous crowds crying hysterically while listening to the words of a preacher who successfully manipulates their imagination. Tu imprensiva. While Leonardo's specific terminology in chapter 15 of the Libro di Pittura demonstrates his familiarity with the psychological discourses of his time, his realignment of the faculties in their ventricles and invention of a new agent create a new enigma. Leonardo relocated the sensus communis, the analytical sense, the most prominent inhabitant of the first ventricle, to the second chamber of the brain, a location heavily contaminated by the image-saturated siblings immaginazione and immaginativa. Instead of the senso comune, Leonardo placed a new faculty in the first ventricle, the imprensiva or impressiva. Leonardo's cohabitation of sensus communis and imagination in its two aspects mirrors the general tendency of Renaissance psychology to reduce the sophisticated scholastic differentiations of the faculties of the soul. This development implies a closer relationship between imaginative and rational faculties. In Leonardo's theory, the noble facultas of the common sense, the agent of judgment, is forced to share its space with a new roommate, or rather twins, the two aspects of imagination with their firework of images. Instead, the first ventricle right behind the forehead receives the new tenant, the imprensiva. What is her task? Leonardo does not clarify, but the terminology and the mechanistic background of his theory of perception imply that this faculty perceives the intensity of sensory representations. In the impressiva, the similitudes of objects press or imprint themselves onto the subtle matter of the mind, the spiritus, before they are further processed. Poetic images are different. In Libro di Pittura, chapter 2, Leonardo explicitly states that the representations of poetry, the products of imagination, do not pass through the impressiva. Who are the precursors of Leonardo's new psychological faculty? I would suggest 3 points of reference. Firstly, Aristotle's metaphor of the senses perceiving the form of things, but not their matter, like soft wax, perceiving the form of the signet ring, not its metal, the signet ring. Secondly, the Stoic idea that phantasmata act as active stimuli, as dynamic impulses causing the recipient's ascent through typosis. For instance, in Epictetus's Enchiridion, a widely diffused text after its translation by Poliziano, the impetus of the phantasma appears in an antagonistic context. The athlete of imaginations, phantasias gymnasteos, masters the impetus of phantasmata, a force attacking the inner fortress of the soul, as Marcus Aurelius put it. The third point of reference appears to be classical rhetoric, with its concept of the impetus of lofty speech, of pathos, sweeping its passionate audience away. For Leonardo, the introduction of the imprensiva reifies, objectifies the fact that perceptions, the similitudes of things, impress the mind. Therefore, the imprensiva operates as a perceptual agent receiving the intensity, clarity, and power of sensory impressions. The products of the writer, words, have no comparable impact. They are, first of all, mere signifiers of the perceived object and need to be decoded. Leonardo's imprensiva is never concerned with codes. It is an inner sense perceiving spontaneously the world's impact on us, especially through the sense of sight, Leonardo's paradigm for perception. In contrast to writing, only paintings close in this perspective the epistemological cycle of impressions. Better, they transpose and reinforce this cycle on a higher level. The emanations of nature, visible images, similitudini, have an impact on men, striking both the eye and the imprensiva of the beholder. Inside the human brain, these natural representations are further processed and result in mental representations through imagination and the transformative combinatory power of imaginativa. Their impact on the mind increases rather than weakening. Through the hands of the painter, these transformed emanations of nature become again a physical object, a surface emanating visual simulacra that strike its beholders imprensiva even more effectively than their natural prototype. This is one reason why Leonardo insists that the practice of painting is more noble, pudenia, than merely theoretical knowledge. As an interpreter of nature, painting is part of nature's continuous generation of images. It clarifies and renews the world. And I know this sounds very much like end of 19th century theory, Konrad Fiedler or A.B. Warburg, but that's something to discuss. I think that's the trajectory of Leonardo's thought. 3 dark eyes, linked to phaos, light, and phainasthai, to shine forth. The traditional notion of fantasia denotes the very opposite of Leonardo's occhio tenebroso. With this metaphor, Leonardo refers to a time-honored religious topos, an adaptation not unusual for his literary practice, both as an advocate of painting and as a technologist. Paraphrasing scripture, Leonardo turns the holy paradigm of writing against the medium itself. In the Bible, the dark eye represents blindness, old age, and imminent death. So in Genesis 27, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dark that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son," etc. Similarly, in the Legenda Aurea, the darkening eyes mark the exodus of Christ. Those eyes who were brighter than the sun became dark. But dark eyes also feature prominently in wrathful execration. For instance, in Psalm 69, "May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Put out your wrath on them, let your fierce anger overtake them." Generally, every eye is dark before the future kingdom of justice. Then the eyes of those who see will no longer be dark, and the ears of those who hear will listen. Dark eyes signify a lack or even the inability of knowledge and wisdom. Desire darkens the eye of the heart. Dark eyes are a metaphor for the moral corruption of their owners, according to Augustine and Gregory the Great, for instance. To call the imagination an occhio tenebroso is thus a poisoned dart in the context of Leonardo's Paragone and its larger epistemological claims. With his metaphor, Leonardo cleverly adopts a time-honored criticism of imagination by religious authorities themselves. Leonardo's coeval, Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola, still warns against the deathly shadows of imagination, imaginationum tenebras, and recommends the enlivening rays of the Bible in order to expel their darkness. Leonardo, however, does not refer to scripture as a remedy to overcome the obscurity of mental images. Instead, it is the glory of the eyes, of the body, to receive the emanations of objects in light, and thus to reveal the divine law in nature. 4, and very quickly, assimilation. Leonardo's rejection of poetic imagination should not be confounded with the general denial of imagination. Indeed, Leonardo repeatedly refers to fantasia as a part of the science of painting, as for instance in his argument against the less imaginative genre of sculpture. Come la pittura è più bella e di più fantasia, or with his demand that painters should be able to reproduce the effects of nature by using their fantasy, fare di fantasia presso agli effetti di natura. Leonardo's main criterion for successful painting, accuracy, is indeed embedded in his celebration of variety, including the novel and unseen, the imaginary. The painter is signore e dio of all the real, present or imaginative past and future objects of the universe, ciò che nell'universo per essenza, presenza o immaginazione. Leonardo's critique aims at the immaginativa rather than at immaginazione. His main antagonists are the libere finzioni, the spontaneous fancies, subconscious projections, and hybrid recombinations detached from the paradigm of nature. These free creations of fantasy, caused by the powerful influence of the specific physical body on the mind, are merely weak in poetry, but dangerous in science. In a later passage, Leonardo warns against the cose mentali that are not grounded in sensory experience. They are harmful in medicine and responsible for the aberrations of alchemy and the perpetuum mobile, an obsessive delusion of the younger Leonardo. Leonardo's increasing focus on dynamic relations, on antagonistic processes in nature, reveals his ideal of imaginatio as an assimilative faculty of the soul, as a pure mirror of nature. Traditionally, fantasia refers to two rather static aspects of mental representations, the image of an absent object and the recomposition of imaginative hybrids. In a famous passage of his Libro di Pittura, Leonardo recommends to exercise the painter's mind, modo da aumentare e destare l'ingegno a varie invenzioni, by carefully observing stains on humid walls of ashes, clouds, and mud, a vague echo, as Martin Kemp has shown, of passages in Aristotle's De Somnis, Philostratus, and even Lorenzo de' Medici. These amorphous objects gain shape only through an active imagination, but Leonardo's sequence of inventions provided by Macchia is significant. Quote, combats both of animals and men, or landscapes and monstrosities like devils or similar things, end quote. Monsters are indeed the classical topos of the combinatory immaginativa, but with battles, Leonardo's fantasy projects dynamics and violence into amorphous perceptions. After around 1500, major fields of Leonardo's science, like hydrology, botany, geography, and anatomy, foreground change, process, and a topic Francesca Borgo is currently working on, often antagonism, with competing actors on a stage ruled by the laws of mechanics. This emphasis on process is mirrored in impressive, sometimes exceedingly long descriptions, forcing the imagination of the reader thereby to participate in the flow of events. This is to be sure neither the static stockpile of film stills traditionally provided by imaginatio, nor the free recombination of visual elements by imaginativa. Instead, Leonardo postulates that the painter-scientist should transform himself into the mirror of nature, into a dynamic seconda natura, a mirror continuously changing color, with its paradigm. Following the model of the sense as lover, moving with the sensible, the beloved, in Codex Trivulziano, Leonardo challenges the mind of the painter to move with the proper similitudes of objects. Again, Leonardo's concept of the mind refers back to the beginnings of the third book of De Anima, where Aristotle defines fantasia as, quote, a movement caused by actual perception, end quote. But Leonardo transforms a psychological statement into a distinctive quality of the painter. As a painter and as a scientist, he became increasingly aware that perception must be permeated by active imagination in order to fully comprehend the temporal dimensions of nature. My last point, 5, swallowed up. Compared to Leonardo's verdict of fantasy as an occhio tenebroso, his paintings and writings demonstrate a remarkable affinity for darkness. His dark manner emerged as early as his unfinished adoration of the Magi and culminated in his late St. John the Baptist. Beginning in his earliest notebooks, he was fascinated by shadows and acknowledged that their power exceeded the force of light. In his most prestigious secular painting, Leonardo thematizes the occhio tenebroso in a literal sense. The central group of fighters in his Battle of Anghiari represents the very instance before the rider on the far right will stab his spear into the eye of the second rider from the left, a contest of aiming eyes of both the riders and the beholders, as it were, with blindness equivalent to ultimate defeat. Leonardo's most imaginative works reveal an intimate relationship between imagination and violence. The background of his adoration of the Magi comes to mind, with fighting horsemen and others riding frantically through ruins. Leonardo's early studies for a Madonna with a cat fathom the delicate border between tenderness and the possibly violent reaction of the feline. As argued above, Leonardo's projections on amorphous stains on the wall result in images of violence as well. Immediately after his lines about poetry's occhio tenebroso in the Libro di Pittura, Leonardo refers to the representation of a battle. Leonardo's own immaginativa naturally gravitates towards disturbing images of catastrophe and transgression. In one of his most important prophezie, written around 1505, on a page mainly about weight and the overcoming of other weight in the context of experiments with scales, Leonardo lists themes of dreams in the following sequence: ruins in the sky, flight, flames in the sky, talking animals, instantaneous movement across enormous distances, powerful lightning in the dark, falls from this here, vedanno nelle tenebre grandissimi splendori, falls from great heights, torrents sweeping the dreamer away, and finally, incest with mother and sisters, and conversations with animals about knowledge. An interesting combination. Userai carnalmente con madre e sorelle, parlerai con gli animali di scienza. The unleashed immaginativa creates images of disaster and transgression, but also knowledgeable animals, revealing their secrets, a hint at Leonardo's contemporary studies on the flight of birds. More importantly, Leonardo's fragments of literary fiction demonstrate a close relationship between imagination and death, his literary fictions. They aim at the great excellence that would allow their images to live on in the mind of the reader. Still, their power is a result of violence, of horror. Literary images survive, in this perspective, as vampires, not only Mona Lisa, but also the literary images, as vampires feasting on the fading lives of their subjects. They owe their eccellencia to the darkness of their topics. Two of Leonardo's most ambitious texts conclude in the dark, with the occhio tenebroso of total oblivion. Already in his famous early text about the fictitious discovery of the fossils of a giant fish in a cavern high in the mountains, Leonardo combines the motives of light, the blinding darkness of the cavern, fear, and the death of the animal, vivified by the historical imagination of the visitor who considers the former life of the fish in an ocean that had disappeared over time. A few years later in Milan, around 1490, Leonardo wrote a fictive letter to his friend Benedetto Dei, a great traveler and explorer of the Orient and friend of Luigi Pulci, author of Morgante. Leonardo's letter is in the form of a report recounting events of the East, qua de Levante, namely about a giant from the Libyan desert who threatens an entire population with extinction. Men hide like insects in the dark cavities of the earth, but in vain. In the end, all are doomed. Now, through a characteristic acceleration of the imaginative mind, now the giant has even captured the writer himself, who composes his report headlong inside the giant's throat, almost a caricature of Leonardo's sacrosanct eyewitness principle. The text is deliberately fragmented, becoming the supposed last words of the reporter entering the dark bowels of his killer. Significantly, the text ends with the word stomach, ventre. Darkness is a precondition for, yet at the same time, a natural enemy of painting. In a passage dated June 6, 1505, coming to the end, Leonardo describes the opposite of an epiphany, the sudden tempest that overcame Florence at the very same moment he started working on the walls of the Palazzo Vecchio. The violence of the maltempo prohibited the realization of the large battle piece, a special case of paragone between an envious nature and the artist. The cartoon was torn apart, a great rain started pouring down, and the day became dark as night. Estette il tempo come notte. Leonardo's constant inclination to combine imagination with the figure of the end of life, of narration, later culminates in his fictitious letter to the Devada of Syria. And one cannot help to note the striking combination of Libya and Syria in these reports. Again, a pragmatic report mutates into a series of nightmarish images describing events that preceded the imminent cataclysm of Monte Tauro, a mountain tall enough to cast a shadow in winter as long as a 30 days journey. This is a letter about the end of the world. After the grand chaos at the beginning of time, the elements were separated but are imminently reuniting their powers in rage in order to destroy the human species. Everybody expects the end. The impetus and furor of winds horrify the people. Majestic mountains are already collapsing. A deluge of water and devastating thunderstorms filled with rain, sand, mud, and stone hit the country. Then lightning then sets it on fire. But all this, Leonardo concludes, is nothing, the letter, compared to the unspeakable evil that is waiting. The imminent horror cannot be described as the text implies, both because the author will be dead soon and because language cannot capture the utter violence of these events. Pittura, however, can, as Leonardo's later Deluge series demonstrates. Leonardo's best literary fictions reflect the concept of the immaginativa as a laboratory of transgression, of violence, and ultimately of death. These are documents of the Occhio Tenebroso. These texts suggest an intimate relationship between literary invention and darkness. With their emphasis on the end of both author and language, Leonardo claims that texts, like most mental images, ultimately, and in contrast to painting, quote, come to a halt and die, end quote. Thank you very much.